Okay, we are going to go ahead and get started. And Noah and Tom, if you could please turn your video on and your mic while I do introductions. All right. Well, welcome everyone to the 2022 Plant Webinar Series. We started these in 2020 during the lockdown, COVID lockdown, as something, we know we weren't meeting as groups, but just something sort of refreshing, something different to think about during the whole COVID. Not that we still aren't thinking about COVID, but we started them then and we're continuing them this year. So this year is probably going to be less specific, going through a lot of plant identification. And what we're going to focus on is urban green spaces and looking at the different plant species that are there in association with each other, invasive, native, looking more at the maintenance side of things, looking at the plant community. So we'll do a little plant identification. And so joining us, we have Dr. Tom Rosburg, who is a botanist, plant ecologist at Drake University, on the faculty at Drake University. He's one of our state's experts on plants in Iowa's different ecosystems. And also joining us is Noah Truesdell. So he's relatively new to ISWEP staff. He's going to be running the video that we took. And for some of you that are new to this, is what we're going to do is we will play the video and there'll be a couple of stops along the way. We'll play, we'll pause, and then you all can either unmute yourselves or use the chat area, which I will monitor, to ask Tom questions, or you may have suggestions or experiences that you want to share as well. So we try and make this as interactive as we can. So, and one thing we noticed is we use Premiere Pro, Adobe's Premiere Pro software. And there have been some changes to that. So we noticed some of the greens in the rendered video are a little different. So and I promise by the next event, things will have improved. And also the iPhone technology has changed. And so there are a couple little hiccups and such, but we'll give you a good program nonetheless. So Noah is going to be running the video from Premiere Pro rather than typically running the direct file, because we're getting much better colors and such through Premiere Pro. We're not 100% sure why this is happening, but there must have been some change with the software. So I think we're going to go ahead and
we've got
Go ahead, Noah.
Oh, you just cut out for a second, so I was just going to finish up. But yeah, I did get it figured out. I just didn't have enough time to export the video. So
okay. Okay. All right. So we are going to go ahead and get started. So remember, you can use the chat area for questions. And as you're thinking through things, or if you want to share experiences as well. And then the other thing is we will pause. We've got a couple of breaks in the video. We will pause and we can make it more interactive. You can ask questions or use the chat area. So Noah, let's go ahead and get started. And Tom and I will mute ourselves. Hi, this is Pat Sauer, and this is year 3 of looking at urban plants, or plants in different urban spaces. Joining me is Tom
Rosburg over here from Drake University.
And
10 Tritech, City of Des Moines.
So we're here at Ewing Park in the city of Des Moines, and we're going to be looking at different aspects of the park and thinking about green spaces first. What we typically do training associated with stormwater management, but looking at urban green spaces in terms of how can we capture and infiltrate and have healthy environments that provide all those ecosystem benefits. Not just looking at stormwater management, but the plant communities, the wildlife communities that exist here, and a whole host of other benefits, including recreation and human health and such. So we're going to get started on this tour.
So Ewing Park was deeded to the city by the Coffin family roughly 50 years ago. And the city has done various maintenance things since then. I know back when it first started, they had mowed the entire area with tractors with brush hogs on the back. But that has not happened in a long time. And you can see behind me what it now looks like without any management done to it recently. And what we're doing is we're coming in with a forestry mower and cleaning up some of the honeysuckle, and just so we can walk in there and treat the invasives. And then we'll also use a diamond deck to mow once the forestry mower has opened it up. And then we try and use prescribed fire on the whole park, but a lot of the times until we get a little bit more of the canopy opened up, the fire doesn't go very far into the woodland. And we try and burn it once every 2 to 3 years, given the right conditions, and it needs to really be dry for that fire to carry through the woodland.
And Ken, can you talk a little bit about the area that has been managed most recently?
Yeah, we mowed it, and then we came in and removed, well, I'd say 50% of the trees that we would like to remove. We're trying not to do that too much to keep the wind from blowing over the trees that have gotten used to having no wind go through there. And then we recently burned this spring, and we will try and burn it again 2 years from now. And it is markedly different than the other area.
And what is the benefit of opening up the canopy and removing undesirable tree species in the understory? What's the benefit of that?
The benefit of that is we can get more growth on the ground, and that creates more ground cover. A lot of times honeysuckle, it's bare underneath it, and we like to see plants growing so that you can have more areas for wildlife, easier to walk through, manage, and treat everything.
And what sort of, is there any, you had talked a little bit about equipment, but what sort of equipment is sort of roughly what size type equipment do you use for maintenance?
The forestry mower is a self-contained unit. It's roughly the size of a large bobcat with metal tracks on it. And we have a 770 bobcat that we use for the diamond deck.
And how many staff do you have that are used to maintain this 300 plus park area?
Well, our staff, the staff that the NRC crew manages the forests and the prairies, and it is 2, and we just have an additional 3rd full-time person that came on 2 weeks ago, and we have 3 7-monthers that help us.
Okay. And tell me about the management. Is there a management plan for the park?
Yes, in the woodlands, we're trying to get in there and burn them and then clean up the down trees so that we don't have to put every single tree out every time we burn. And then once we do that, we will try and get it mowed and try and keep it mowed, and we will also treat the honeysuckle and other invasives like oriental bittersweet is all throughout this park too. So we're treating those.
And how do you prioritize the areas in the park? Is there a plan? Is the park divided up into regions or areas?
We have kind of divided it into the areas we've started working on the east side of the park and areas we haven't. So if we have a chance, we'll get to where we've started to work on that area and get that completed before we'll move on, just to try and finish an area first.
In 2011, 2012, Des Moines Parks and Recreation hired me to conduct a natural resource inventory of the parklands. It kind of had 2 major goals. The most important one was to do surveys in parks like Ewing here that have a strongly sort of natural landscape remnant or aspect to them. So roughly 3,000 acres of parkland was surveyed, and the goal was to map what the extant ecosystems are and plant communities are right now, so what exists here now. And then also I tried to give the parks an idea of what used to be here by looking at soils, looking at old aerial photos, try to interpret those, and also actually GLO maps. Those are the government land office maps, which again show what the land surveyors saw here back in 1850s or so. But to give them an idea of what, again, what kinds of ecosystems and plant communities occupied this landscape prior to what we see now. That gives them at least some idea maybe of what direction they might want to go when they think about restoration. So a lot of what happens in Ewing Park, I think, is a good example, of course, is that had much of our landscape through the Des Moines area because of the way that fire would have occurred on this broken landscape, rough landscape. It wouldn't have been a complete burn. It would have been broken up again by the topography. Fire would have been reduced somewhat to lower intensities and frequencies, which of course promotes the growth of trees, but probably not near to the extent that we see here. It's my opinion that probably most of the landscape here was a combination of prairies, savannas, and woodlands. And I use the term woodland in a different way than maybe is conventionally used. There's really four basic ecosystem types that depend upon the environment, depend upon the amount of fire that's occurred in the past. So you have prairie, where virtually there's no trees, less than 10% canopy covered by trees. But then as fire is diminished because of whatever reasons and factors in the environment to not occur quite as often, becomes a little bit more patchy. A few more trees are able to survive those fires. Now you get to a range where the canopy cover is between 10 and 35%. That's a savanna. And you can just keep more parts of the landscape where fire was reduced, the frequency was even less, and therefore then the frequency of trees goes up. We get to the range of 35 to 65% canopy cover. That's a woodland. And then in the most fire-resistant parts of the landscape, the parts of the landscape, again, that would provide the most protection to trees, there's where we have the forests. And the forests are 65% canopy cover or more. And again, I think that probably most of this landscape was a woodland, savanna, prairie mosaic. And because, of course, the loss of fire as an environmental factor happened a long time ago and has been a factor for a long, long time, it's those savannas and woodlands that had a tree component already present that it's easy for them then to increase that tree component because there's a source of seeds. And especially a woodland. A woodland can, fairly quickly succeed to a forest. It doesn't take too long for additional trees to come in and fill in those gaps, and before you know it, again, you've got canopy coverage that's 65%. So again, what the park, what Des Moines Parks and Rec, decides to do might be somewhat based again on sort of what might have been here at least, but you also have to factor in, what's reasonable too. In some cases, although there may be signs that this area was a savanna with, again, maybe 20% canopy covers of trees and a lot more openness in the herb layer, if it's now a forest that's got 80% canopy cover and a herbaceous layer that has no prairie species whatsoever, it kind of doesn't make sense to spend all that time and effort trying to go back to something that's going to be really hard to do. You still got an environment that supports biodiversity, just a different type. So then the other part of what I did for the Park Service, the Des Moines Parks, I should say, was more focused on the smaller parks, parks that have more open green space and are more playgrounds and recreational areas. In those areas, I just did surveys of the trees. I think in these larger areas, though, again, the goal was to find what kinds of plant species are here, a floristic inventory of each one of those plant communities and ecosystems that I mapped, trying to focus again on a common and abundant species, and then also trying to know whenever I found really bad populations of invasive species, or when I found populations of unique species, anything that would be an imperiled species. I found 7 different populations of imperiled plant species within the parks, and lots of course, highly conservative plant species. So, and that's the kind of information I think that's probably going to be most useful, and hopefully helps folks like Ken, think about, what's the best management strategy for them to go forward. That was the whole point, of course, of this survey, was to provide them with a baseline inventory of what they've got. You really can't really do a good job, or at least, I guess profess that you're doing a good job of managing some land unless you really know what you've got. Unless you know what's there, then it's going to be kind of hard to know for sure what's going to be the best direction to go.
Ken, could you tell us, how do you decide which trees to remove in a woodland like this?
Well, we first look at trees and try and release those, like an oak, a hickory, a walnut, a lot of times, sometimes a basswood. And what we'll do is we'll just pick the trees around it and remove those first. And then we're trying not to take out too many trees to give that tree time to get used to the more wind so it doesn't blow over. And if some of the trees that we want to take out are too big, we will girdle them and leave them for the wildlife to use. And so a lot of the other overstory tree that we leave a lot is hackberry. There seems to be a lot of those.
We walked over here to this area that Ken pointed out earlier hasn't had any removal of the understory or thinning happening yet. So we're going to take a look and see what's growing over here. And of course, the first thing we notice right away is the invasive species, like I'm standing in front of right here. This is Tatarian honeysuckle, on that top 10 list of some of the most invasive species. There's 2 species, of course, that are really hard on us, Tatarian and the Amur honeysuckle. This one is Tatarian because we can see the shape of the leaf here. Fits it better. There's another invasive back here, a little bit further back. This one is the common privet, which again is another example of a species that's introduced for landscaping purposes and has escaped into our natural areas. Get a close-up of the leaves. So those are the 2 most invasive problematic species I'm seeing right here along this edge. Again, you can kind of look through the background here, and any place you see those white flowers, that's some honeysuckle. But what else is here? Well, there's some good things like the false Solomon seal you see right here, beginning to form some flowers here. False Solomon seal. This one down here, right next to it, is common black snakeroot. Again, starting to form some flowers. There's some sedges in through here. I noticed one right here. Without pulling this up and looking at it real close, my guess is this is Carex aggregata, the cluster sedge. And here's another of the non-natives that is a problem species, a little bit smaller version of one here. This is multiflora rose. And we can see some native shrubs, like buckbrush right here. Symphoriocarpus, you see there, Symphoriocarpus orbiculatus or Symphoriocarpus occidentalis. Depends on whether it has red or white fruits at the end of the summer. Then I noticed that there's this nice young specimen of oak right here, a bur oak. A tree this size, which is about 10 centimeters, again, it's sort of an uncommon tree size to see in any of our forests nowadays, because the size distribution that I see most often in forests and woodlands is we've got a good number of the grandparent trees, like to call them, the big oaks, And there's a couple examples here, of course, that we can look at later. And then there's always usually a lot of maybe small little seedlings. I noticed some seedlings over there, about that size or so. But the age classes that are in between the small and the grandparent size, we don't see too many of those. Here's a good example of one that we do have, this size range here. And this is the size that, we need to see more of these trees in our woodlands and forests to replace the older trees when they die of natural causes, or wind blowing them down or wherever it might be. Because if we don't have these sizes of oaks coming along to fill in, then the forest gets replaced by other trees that have trees in this size range and are probably going to be more like basswoods or maples or more the tree species that are more tolerant of shade. So that's one of the challenges, I think, that any land resource manager has nowadays, like Ken, is if you want to try to maintain our oak woodlands and forests, somehow we've got to help encourage the regeneration of oaks from the shrub size. That, again, we have seedling and shrub size plants. We need to get more of them into the teenager and young adult size that we see here. Now we've walked up the hill slope a little bit here into this area that Ken described as, again, having a lot of work done, removing some of the brushiness, removing the invasive species here, and clearing out the understory somewhat. We can see that it's clearly more open, and that helps, again, to promote a more vigorous herb layer. And because of the extra light, we should maybe see again, a little bit more representative species of plants in the herb layer here that like a woodland environment. And a couple come to mind right away. As we walked up here, I noticed Solomon seal right here. Solomon seal, which is similar looking to false Solomon seal, but it has its flowers coming off the underside of the plant in the leaf axils. Each of these leaves has a little down here, or at least the start of a flower. This is a plant, I believe, that really is more of a woodland species. I quite often see it in even more sunny environments than this. So I think it's a good example of a plant that, if it had its choice, it would be in a savanna or an open woodland. But because those habitats are all closed in now for the most part on our landscapes, and now are sort of technically a forest, we see it in those environments. And here's an important point. Just because we see it in those forest environments now, that doesn't mean that it prefers that environment. It's there because that's what it's got. It's still a hangover, if you might say, a leftover from a time when, again, the environment might have been more open, and its ancestors, again, were living in a more of a woodland or savanna. But a lot of these plants, of course, will hang on in the environment. They may not prosper quite as much, but we think of them then as forest species because that's where we see them. Well, we see them there because that's the only place that they have. Another good example of that many of you probably are familiar with are the trout lilies. So we can see some leaves down here. They're finishing up. This is the spring ephemeral that was in bloom probably a couple weeks ago, if it was in fact in bloom. Not all plants are going to bloom. That's another good example, I think, of a species that, again, on the native landscape was probably did its best, had its highest population success in more of an open woodland. We also have some anise root right here. Just some other things to point out. Anise root, Osmorrhiza longistylus. It has, like its name suggests, its styles on these flowers are extra long compared to its congener, Osmorrhiza claytonii, sweet cicely. So sweet cicely and anise root look very. You can tell them apart really easy right now because you got those flowers with those long styles right there. Another one that we see, aptly named woodland phlox, is this one growing right here amongst this moonseed. Here we go. Woodland phlox, Phlox divericata. 5 petals, fused corollas, very long tube. It's pollinated by an insect with a proboscis that's a little bit longer, can reach down that long tube. And up here we also see some more of the black snakeroot, common black snakeroot that we just pointed out a little bit ago. I found some plants here that I think really have an important role in what Ken and Des Moines Parks want to try to accomplish here. Here's a sedge. This is Carex gricia, or eastern woodland sedge. You can pan on that close. The plant is right down here below me, right down here. And then another graminoid is this one right here, woodland fescue. It's just beginning to form a flower head there. There's another clump of it just a little ways away. But if it might be possible for Pat to kind of pan just around this area right here, we see a lot of younger grass-like plants coming up. That's going to be a really important part of, again, transitioning this to a woodland. Because the grasses provide a very important, and the sedges, because they're like a grass, provide a very important ecosystem function in how they promote the frequency of fire. Grasses have a fine texture to them, and so when they senesce and die back, the fuel that they provide is a fine fuel, more of a fine fuel, as opposed to some of the more coarse types of fuels that come from the forbs. It's that fine fuel that really helps to promote a fire then and carry the fire through. What we want to see here, of course, is what we call a surface fire. Make sure that you understand we're not talking about a canopy fire or anything like that. We don't have those here. But a surface fire, which of course burns the herb layer. Any of the woody vegetation that's, like this little honeysuckle right here that's sprouted back, those will be top killed by a fire. Any of the small woody stems, the shrubs and saplings will be affected by the heat of the fire and top killed. Larger trees, aren't going to be affected. Not going to be enough heat that will penetrate their bark, and they're going to survive the fire just fine. At some point, trees stems get large enough to tolerate that heat. But saplings, so stems that could be up to maybe an inch or so in diameter, maybe 2 inches in diameter. I did a study a while back looking at fire effects in a woodland forest system, and we found that a surface fire, low intensity surface fire, did have an effect in increasing the mortality of saplings. So again, trees that are usually a couple meters high at least. These could be young trees, of course, of species that are growing there. 2 meters or so tall, maybe up to a couple inches in diameter. The heat can kill those, and again cause them to at least top kill them, kill off the top. It won't kill the roots, but at least reduce the size of those woody plants to something that will grow back from the root system that'll be a lot smaller. That causes, again, more light to come into the environment. It helps to increase the growth of herbaceous layer, helps to increase the growth of the sedges and graminoids. And what happens then, in a sense, if fire happens enough and you keep that cycle of keeping that woody growth down and minimized at least, is that it's a positive feedback. The more fire you have, the more fine fuels you develop. The more fine fuels you develop, the more it's easy to carry a fire. The hotter that fire gets, the more damage it does to woody plants. And again, it can be a positive feedback mechanism that takes you in the direction, then at least, of making the herb layer and the ecosystem more open.
Question for you, Tom. Is the herbaceous layer that is here, is this all native seed bed, or would this have been seeded?
This is all native plant material that was in populations that were able to live in a shaded environment, however much shading and understory density there was here. which of course was quite a bit more than we're seeing now. So these are examples of plants that were able to tolerate, for the most part, tolerate shading. Now, they again probably weren't this extensive back when there was a thicker layer of invasive shrubs through here, but they were still here, and probably in lesser numbers, maybe in a more depauperate form. And what we're seeing is sort of an explosion, I suppose you might say, at least a better growth, better productivity because of the removal of those invasive shrubs. But I think for the most part, yeah, these were all here. I don't think the parks have seeded anything, so they haven't done any seeding here. Could that be done? Yes, I think that could be a strategy at some point in time to try to, again, convert this herbaceous layer into something that, again, would be more representative of perhaps what it should have been or was like when there was more light here. Clearly, there could be some populations that have been lost here because of the density of that layer of invasive shrubs.
So this is an example of a girdle tree. We used a chainsaw.
Okay, so at this point, we are going to pause the video. We got a little bit into tree girdling, and this is your opportunity, excuse me, please, to either unmute yourselves and ask questions on any of the topics that were presented, or use the chat area. So anyone care to ask? I know I have a couple of questions, but anyone have any questions at all for Tom? Well, I'll go ahead and ask a question. So we talked a little bit about burn management, and when you're dealing with woodlands, what time of year is best, and should you alternate that seasonality? What are the different seasons that burns can be done, and what is the seasonality that is associated? What are the recommendations?
That's a very good question, because the timing of the burn is probably one of the most important aspects of the burn, when the burn occurs and what's its ecological effects are going to be. And so if you're talking about forests, open forests and woodlands, it's a more challenging environment to burn in, generally speaking, because it's usually more moist and it's harder for it to dry out, the fuel that you do have. I think one strategy is, just to get burns through whenever you can, whenever the conditions are going to be appropriate and support that burn. You have a problem in the spring because often it's going to be wet from snow melt, maybe from some spring rains. And again, it takes a little bit longer to dry out. And so the window of opportunity may not be so good. Otherwise, in the fall, again, another option. Fall can be better in some regards because maybe there'll be drier times, drier days, lower humidity. But then you also usually have quite a bit of green herbaceous vegetation too. So it could be quite a challenge. I mean, I guess that would be a good question for Ken. He could speak to what they've seen, I guess, in their burns. I think he said that they had done a burn there in the spring. So they were able to get a burn through there. It kind of depends upon, again, what the spring is like. If it's a drier spring, then that would be a good time to try to get a burn through there. I think, I guess my overall thought is just try to find, when you're getting started, try to get a burn through there whenever you can, because it's going to be challenging in some ways. Because quite often the very first time you start doing this, there may not be quite the fine fuels and the fuel densities, the kinds of fuel, the kinds of plants that promote fuel there. So when you are starting this process, it's kind of a long process to start getting the ecosystem, back in more of a natural state. I know out at White Rock Conservancy, that would be a good place to go visit and talk about this, because they've been doing woodland forest burns for many, many, many years. And they will do them both in the spring. They'll try and get some done in the spring. They'll try and get some done in the fall. Burning both times of year, it, again, kind of really depends upon the type of forest, the types of leaves that are being produced by those trees. Oak forests and oak leaves are always going to be a better situation to promote fire than non-oaks. There's this idea, and I think it's pretty reasonable, that the structure and the way the oak leaves stay on the tree for quite a long period of time. They don't necessarily drop their leaves right away in the fall. They hang on to their leaves. If you ever notice, you can see many oaks carrying their leaves through the winter. The idea is that oaks have adapted to retain those leaves on the tree, keep them theirs through the winter. They eventually will drop them, of course, in the spring as they begin to leaf out. But by doing that, then the leaves are not on the soil for as long a period of time. They don't become compressed and dampened like all the other leaves are, all the maples and elms and ashes and everything. You get a sort of a leaf litter layer that's been compressed by snow and is wet. Then again, that's going to be really difficult to dry out. It's going to be difficult for a burn to go through there. Oak leaves also tend to, as they die and fall off the tree, they curl. They form these curl formations. And the idea there is that that helps to prevent packing of those oak leaves. The whole idea of this is that oaks are adapted to produce leaves that come off the tree at a time and remain and form a leaf litter structure that's more open and airy. That the curling of those leaves would tend to help make there be more air spaces in the layer of leaves that are on the surface. And by doing that, oaks are trying to, in a sense, promote a better fuel condition and promote better environmental conditions for surface fires, because oaks need surface fires at some frequency, again, to help maintain a more open understory so that their babies have opportunity to grow into larger sized trees.
Hey, another question, and then Paige, well, let's answer Paige's question. So did you mention that historically this area was not forested? It was likely savanna grass dominant? Is
Right.
first question.
I could pull up the map on my other computer. I don't have it up right now, but for all of the parks, all of the parkland that I surveyed, I made maps that shows the current plant communities and what I would call them, again, mostly forests. But then I also made maps that were based on the soils and based on government land office surveys, was sort of my best interpretation of what the native landscape was like. In most cases, those maps showed a mosaic of savannas and woodlands. Now, you can't you can't really get a woodland out of the soil maps very well, because the soils, when soil scientists look at the soils, they can tell you, well, this soil formed under prairie, this soil formed under forest, this soil formed under a transition. So what they mean by a transition is they're forming in an ecosystem where there's some trees and some prairie. So we interpret that as a savanna. But again, by looking at the types of soil and the drainage qualities, characteristics of the soil, I'm inferring from that those forests, again, or those wooded environments were not quite as dense and didn't have as much canopy cover as what the forests do now. So the idea that there were woodlands there is that's an idea that it's hard to find scientific support for, but that's the feeling that I have about again what the native landscape was like. And again, it is based on also on historic photos too. So that's probably the best way that you can envision what was there, also by looking at 1930s era photos. And quite often in those 1930 era photos, and I can think of many of the parks that show this, Ewing Park, McRae Park, you can see the trees are much more spread out. You can see that the canopy cover is, not 100%. The canopy cover is something more in the range of 50 to 60%. If that's what the canopy cover is, if that's what canopy cover was back in 1930, then in 1930 there was a woodland there. It wasn't a forest. So I'm using those two.
And related, sorry, my dog is barking here. Is it of interest to convert back to the historical condition, or is the goal here to perfect the current forest woodland condition?
Well, I think, as I kind of alluded to in the video, um, by showing people what the native landscape was like, what we think it was like, what our best interpretation was like, that does give them a goal for a parcel of land. And it really comes down to, I think, sort of an ecological assessment of what's left and how close you are to what that native system was like. The further you are away from what that native system was like with what's there now, then it becomes less and less, I guess, sensible, you might say, and certainly less economically feasible and manpower wise feasible to go back to what was there. A great example is if you've got a complete forest now and you used to be a prairie there, well, to go back to a prairie, it's going to take a huge amount of work. You have a lot of wood to deal with, a lot of trees to deal with. Does it make sense to remove all of those? Probably not. I mean, again, I think what a park unit has to do is try to find the best way to manage their land in a way that promotes the most biodiversity that they can. Now, it certainly means at least some of the parkland, the areas that have the most feasibility, and that's again why it's important to do these surveys that I did. Those are the areas then that you could try to push back and go back to a previous time again and restore the native system. Other portions of the park are going to be too far gone, and it doesn't make sense, and that's fine. Those are not going to be what they used to be. Those are not going to be a savanna, or not going to be a woodland, or not going to be a prairie. Those are going to be a forest, or whatever else they are now. But as long as, again, it's still mainly native vegetation, it is an ecosystem that has importance in the park system. Again, it's like I said, it's there, it's supporting biodiversity. It's just supporting different biodiversity than what it did 100 years ago. So, I think the best strategy is you're going to have to leave some the way it is and just kind of manage it for what it is and keep invasive species out. But in other areas, I think it is important to try to get back to what we had, because those areas support a different biodiversity that you're not going to support unless you get those systems back.
Okay. And let's see, one last question for me is, so in terms of getting back to the burn part of it, is tree resistance, the age of tree and the resistance to the burn, is there a concern from it when you're burning the herbaceous layer to damage trees? And are there tree types and ages of trees or diameters of trees that are more sensitive to burns?
Oh yes, for sure. Any younger tree is going to be much more sensitive to a burn. So any younger tree and any age, less than, oh gosh, probably 20 years or something. I'm just taking a guess there. The thinner the bark is, the more susceptible the tree is. And there are going to be species that simply just have thin bark. They are good examples of trees then that have not really evolved in a fire environment. Having thicker bark was not an important strategy for them. So those are tree species that are not adapted to fire. Those are going to be fire sensitive species. Those are going to be mostly, again, the trees that you'd find in a fire protected part of the landscape. So the black maples and basswoods. Those are the trees that are supposed to be there, and they're there because those parts of the environment never really burned, and they're able to do fine there. most of the oaks, of course, especially bur oak and black oak and white oak to some extent, are more capable of withstanding fire. We know that that bur oaks and black oaks, for example, have thicker bark, which is important in protecting that phloem tissue. The damage that a tree has to be concerned about, especially a taller tree, is the only way a fire can hurt it is if there's enough heat to penetrate the bark deep enough and to kill the phloem tissue. The phloem tissue, which is right underneath the bark, which is also, of course, conducting food from the leaves down to the roots and feeding the roots. Smaller woody vegetation, things in the shrub size, seedling size, shrub size, and small sapling size, those can be completely consumed by flames if the flames are tall enough. And of course, those are then going to just completely get burned up, or else the buds that are on the branches of those individuals will be damaged by the fire. If buds are damaged by the fire, that's also going to be a way of top killing them, because now those buds can't regrow. And so the strategy of a tree, which is always to regrow from new growth that's already produced the previous year and keep getting taller and taller and taller. If it can't do that, it can't regrow from buds because the buds have been killed by fire. Then again, you've top killed that tree. It's been top killed. If you kill the phloem tissue, damage the phloem tissue enough, then again, it's going to not be able to feed the roots, and that's more likely again top kill the tree too. It may actually completely kill the tree, because if it can't feed the roots, then the roots might die as well. So in most cases, a surface fire through a wooded environment, a woodland or forest, never really gets to great intensity. You don't usually have very high flame heights. It's usually a creeping fire that will often become somewhat patchy and miss places, which is fine. And so you don't have to worry too much about the larger trees. Those smaller woody plants that are going to be affected, because they don't really have any protection from the heat. Now, having said that, I just finished some field work out in the Les Hills State Forest, and on a site that was burned the first part of May. And it's a good example of what can happen in a situation in a landscape that's much different than what Des Moines Parks is working with, for example. In this particular unit, there was a lot of reconstructed prairie and even a lot of native prairie on the upper ridges. There were forests that were located on some of the slopes between the ridges and between the lower ground, which is reconstructed prairie. And when they burned that, they had a really good fire day. Again, low humidity, probably some winds, higher temperatures, and because they were burning reconstructed prairie, and this is important to think about, because that's how it would have happened on the native landscape. The fire burning in the reconstructed prairie produced great intensity, lots of fuel, high flame heights, and I'm sure the wind carried and pushed that fire right into those forested areas. And it's pretty amazing to see how many large trees were killed. You can kill large trees. You just have to have a lot of heat and a lot of intensity. But this is, again, this site, it's at the Les Hills Overlook site, which is just right west of Preparation Canyon State Park. You can go there and you can stand on that overlook and you can see this. They produced an amazing amount of fire and heat that killed a lot of trees. Again, that's what they wanted to do. They're trying to get rid of the trees, and it even killed some of the oaks. At least affected them, it looks like. I can't tell for sure if they're dead, probably until next year. But there was a lot of dead cedars, of course, a lot of dead other hardwood species, but non-oaks. So it can happen under the right conditions, that we can have fire in Iowa that can kill trees. But in most situations, though, when you're, again, dealing with just the surface fire in a forest, you don't have near that kind of litter. You don't have that fire coming off of a prairie. You're not going to have that kind of intensity. The challenge often in forests and woodland burns is that how much of the dead wood do you want to burn? Do you want to let that burn up? Do you want to put it out so that there's no smoke and there's no nothing burning when you're done? And that just depends upon, I guess, how much time you want to spend there, how much work you want to spend putting out wood. I think it's probably good to burn up some of that wood, but on the other hand, it's also good probably to leave some of that wood out there as well, because dead wood and especially larger logs and stuff on the forest floor are part of the structure of that forest. And that structure, again, is important in providing different kinds of microenvironments, different kinds of habitats for especially small mammals and maybe even birds.
All right. Excellent. Excellent questions. Thanks for your answers, Tom. So Noah, I think we are ready to start up the video again.
So this is an example of a girdled tree. We used a chainsaw to just cut in far enough through the cambium layer so that to prevent the flow of sap going up and down the tree. And that will kill it. And we're trying to leave some of the larger trees for woodpeckers and there's animals that will use the dead trees. So we're not trying to remove all the dead trees.
Why do you make two cuts?
Two cuts, so if you make one cut, it's going to heal over. Two cuts will keep it from healing over.
How long does it take to kill off the tree?
It's it's dead when you do it. It just doesn't know it yet. So, yeah, it'll try and leaf out, but it's not going to grow.
And then the tree, do you come back through and take it down, or you're just going to let it fall? Or
We'll just leave it for wildlife, and then sometimes we do have to monitor it. Sometimes there will be some that start to fall over, and we'll drop them. And sometimes the wind or whatever will just drop. They'll just fall. But
and you're leaving the trees for what purpose? The fallen down trees.
the trees that fall down we will remove. The ones that like this one that is standing, we're going to leave for wildlife. But once they fall, we will remove them. Just make it easier for cleanup after a fire, because we have to have everything put out, no smokers, by sunset. So you light the fire for 1 hour and you put out smokers for 3.
And are there any specific wildlife that you're aware of that benefit from the
Woodpeckers is what red-headed woodpecker is what we're looking at. A little bit more about girdling trees. The roots are still alive and they're still transporting water and nutrients up to the top of the tree, so it'll leaf out and it'll photosynthesize. But those nutrients cannot get back down to the roots because we've severed the connection. And also sometimes we will girdle the tree because it's in a precarious position where there are some trees around it and it looks like it's just going to get hung up, and we don't want to damage the trees that we're trying to keep. So we will just girdle it and just leave it.
And is there a minimum size tree diameter in which girdling is most effective?
I would say about 10-inch DBH, and below we will just drop it. Above that we can girdle it.
And for those not familiar with DBH, what does that stand for?
Diameter, 10-inch diameter.
So a good question might be, what are we standing in? What kind of forest or woodland is this? And so one way of sort of estimating, of course, is to look up. It's nice to be able to look down like a bird, but we can't do that. So we have to look up from the ground, and you kind of get a sense here, looking at how much green versus white sky you see here. And you just have to guesstimate sort of what it is. But I'm looking at this and thinking it might be roughly 65 to 75% canopy coverage, something like that. I put that into the category of an open forest. Remember, forest goes from 65% canopy cover to 100%. But within that range, we can divide it into either a more open, which of course means more light, or more closed, which means less light. And a lot of that is due to the fact that there's not much of a subcanopy or understory here. And so by subcanopy, of course, we mean trees that are just below the height of the canopy trees. So those are the trees that are sitting at that stage where they're next to occupy the canopy whenever a position comes open. And then below the subcanopy, there's often, again, in a forest, there's more layers of trees at different heights. Again, some of those are young trees, some of those are trees that naturally don't grow very tall, like ironwood, saplings, or even shrubs. Those all, again, diminish the light even more. When we're talking about, again, the amount of light that's important, it's the amount of light that's down here at the herb layer. And because of the clearing that they've done here, there's really not much of any of that understory here. That, too, is what's, again, making the canopy coverage much less. There's another plant over here that I noticed as we're walking around that I thought I'd point out, because it's one that is, again, a good species, I think, kind of in open forest or closed woodlands. It's this one right here with the leaves that are in whorls of 5. You see 5 leaves here, all attached at a common point, so a whorl of 5 leaves. This is purple joe pye weed. Eupatorium purpureum was the former name. I believe that's still the current name, though, for this species. Some of the eupatoriums have changed their genus name, but I think this one's still the same.
We're here at what we call the East Prairie. And when Easter Lake was dredged, some of the material was driven via truck, dump truck, to the southern half of this prairie, and we used that for fill. And what has happened is we are getting real erosion from where the trucks have driven. There's I think there's 3 rows here, and as you walk south, there's just a continual line of rills that just come off of the prairie from that.
Okay, so what could be done to repair these areas? Well, there are a couple of options. First off, if they brought a lot of traffic through here, the soils likely are heavily compacted. So I think a combination of tilling and regrading, and you'll get the soils loosened, decompacted. Then you have to think about, well, what are you going to use for vegetation reestablishment? So they're looking at planting prairie. They want prairie in here. They may have to use a nursery crop such as oats. But then also they have slope here, so they'll have to think about how can you break up the slope. And then, of course, you need some sort of erosion control. Otherwise, all of your seed is going to wash away. So what they potentially could do in this area is after regrading, tilling the soil, they could reseed and hydromulch, and the city does happen to have hydromulch equipment, so that's like totally awesome. And then come in here and you need some sort of sediment control to break up the slope length, so they're like little check dams to slow the flow down. So then they would use several rows of wattles or filter socks going down this slope. And then I talked about the erosion control. They could hydromulch with seed, or the other option is that they seed and then they use an open weave blanket of some sort. That could be jute or that could be wood coir. It's important when establishing natives that you use the open weave. Otherwise, based on personal experience, if you use the tightly woven blankets, sunlight will not get down to the soil surface for seed generation, and you'll get a delightful mix of weed growth with very little natives. So anyway, so we'll take a look at the area again and look at how we can better heal the landscape with the combination of sediment controls. First off, tilling and regrading, and then you're going to have seed, some mulch for erosion control, and then some sort of sediment control to break up the slope length.
The East Prairie was seeded about 8 to 10 years ago. We waited until we had treated it in the
Okay, so actually, Noah, I would suggest that you just continue on the prairie video, please. Thanks.
Prairie was seeded about 8 to 10 years ago. We waited until we had treated it in the fall, probably August, September, and October. We sprayed it. And then we waited till late December when we knew it was going to get right above freezing. So I started seeding in the mornings when it was 28 degrees. And I would go with the tractor and seeder until it got too greasy to seed, and then I would stop for the day. So it took me 2 days to seed this. And what was here before was probably just a pasture remnant. And we've burned it every other year for a while, and we burned it this spring. These woody species up here are black locust, and they love fire, or that fire just angers them. So we've been treating them basil bark. And that's anytime after July through January, we'll go hit the bottom 18 inches with triclopyr, and that seems to do a pretty good job of killing them and not having them resprout.
Ken, are there any other tree species that are a challenge or invasive that are a challenge to manage?
In this prairie, not so much Siberian elm, but in a lot of our other prairies, we have a lot of Siberian elm that's a real challenge.
Well, let's take a look at some of the species out here in the prairie Ken was describing. First of all, I'll just say that it looks really nice. It's looking pretty good after this burn. It probably was, I think, on the historic photos, if I recall, looking back on those historic photos, that this is probably used as a pasture area, of course. Probably got, degraded somewhat, of course, because of that, overgrazing. But it also leads to the possibility that although most of what we're seeing here, again, was planted, certainly all these species, and we'll take a look at some of them in just a bit, were planted, there still is a possibility, since it was a pasture area when they started, that there could be some remnant prairie populations here. And in fact, when I did the natural history survey, I did find a couple of species, a couple of sedges, for example, which I know led me to believe right away that they were remnant, because a lot of reconstructions or plantings, don't use them. Two species here. First one I'll draw attention to is this one right here. This is Carex bicknellii, bicknell sedge, and it's important because of its coefficient of conservatism. I think it's about a 9 or so, again, and that's on a 10-point scale. So high coefficient of conservatism essentially means that this is a species that, according to the committee of botanists and ecologists who gave these coefficients, our experience with it says you only really find this species growing if you're on a really decent prairie. The other sedge that I found, and I found again this morning, is this species here, Carex bushii. And it's important because it's a special concern species, which means it's on the imperiled species list for Iowa. It's a special concern category, which doesn't give it legal protection, but it does serve to alert the botanists at the Iowa DNR that this is a species they need to watch. And so finding it here on this, well, again, degraded prairie at the time, and prairie reconstruction, both, was very important, because as it turns out, again, this, as Ken was describing, when Polk County Conservation dredged Easter Lake, their initial intention was to take tons and tons and tons of that dredge material off the bottom of Easter Lake and spread it out over this northern part of the prairie here, closer to the lake, because it's not so far away. However, when I heard about that and was in a committee that advises the Des Moines Parks about, again, how they manage the parks, I reminded them that this is a site for this special concern species. So because we knew the species was here, that allowed then that plan to change. And of course, and also the importance was this Carex bicknellii too. These both represent native populations that exist here. They were not planted. And to avoid destroying those, as Ken said, they adjusted their plans and took the dredge material further to the south and dumped it in an area where it's mainly just brome grass. But there are a lot of really nice species out here. A couple of the others I have in my hand here, a couple of the mountain mints. You see two real common ones here. You can kind of see a basic difference in them, in that one of them is got more narrow leaves, one's got a little broader leaves. If you look real close at this one right here, it's also got a stem that's completely glabrous. There's no hairs on it at all. This one here has hairs along the corners of the stem. Remember, these are mints, and so they have square stems, and the corners of the stems on this one have some hairs. This one is Virginia mountain mint, Pycnanthinum virginianum, and this one is narrowleaf mountain mint, Pycnanthinum tenuifolium. This was also kind of an important one here too, because narrowleaf mountain mint is certainly native to this area, but it tends to be a more southern Iowa species, and so its range doesn't go quite as far north as the Virginia mountain mint. And again, having species at the edges of their ranges, to me at least, again, means that that's a population that should be protected. It may have been another remnant one in here too. I'm not sure if it was on the seed list. Some things in flower though. There's right below me here is some spiderwort. And I looked at the sepals on this earlier. The sepals are these green bracts right here that basically form a flower bud. And you can see the sepals on this one that opened up right here. Since they've got a lot of hairs on them, they're very pubescent. That means this is Tradescantia bracteata, the bracted spiderwort. And again, here's the narrowleaf mountain mint. Here's some, this looks like it's going to be sweet coneflower. Here's some rattlesnake master, Laryngium ecifolium. And again, I say this is in pretty nice shape because they don't see very much cool season grass. If this was indeed a cool season pasture at one time, they did a pretty good job of suppressing it. There's a little bit of bluegrass in some places and maybe a sprig or two of brome here and there, but overall, I'm not seeing very much in the way of those non-native cool season grasses. Here's another one that's commonly planted, and it is appropriate species for this area here. This is Penstemon digitalis, the foxglove beard tongue. And then lots of warm season grasses coming up. These clumps here are some warm season grasses. Looks like maybe Indian grass or big blue stem here, one of the two. Oh, and here is some New England aster. And one more, I guess, at least. Here's round-headed bush clover. So it's looking very nice.
Ken, could you talk a little bit more about the prescribed burns in terms of staffing, their education, training, and then how often your schedule associated with that?
Sure, we use all city staff, and they are trained in the Wildland Fire S-130, 190 course. And we have to go through the burn permit process. So we have a 6-month permit. It usually is October 1st for 6 months or November 1st for 6 months. And we will burn anytime the conditions allow once we have the burn permit. And the big thing with burning in the city is trying to manage the smoke. So you have to get a specific wind direction and not blow the smoke into the neighborhood as much as possible.
Well, one challenge that a land manager might have as they begin to open up what was a forest, or what is a forest, opening it up, like you see here, opening it up more, getting the understory out, getting more light in, is that in some cases, some of the native herbaceous species might sort of over-respond to that. And you can kind of see a fairly good example of that throughout this area. And again, the species we looked at earlier, common black snakeroot. As we walk through here, there's really a large amount of it here. It's really very frequent. It's like every step you're going to see it. And part of the reason, I think, is some of the life history of this plant. Certainly, it produces fruits that have little stick-type structures on them that make the fruit stick to the fur of raccoons and possums and mice, and so that really disperses the fruits, which of course carry the seeds, disperses those seeds far and wide. And I think, again, just the change from a more shaded environment to a more lit environment.
Okay, I guess we're going to pause at this point and find out if anyone has any questions or comments or experiences to share. Reminder to use the chat area, or you can unmute yourselves. So I'll start things off. Here's a question for you, Tom. So you talked about cool season grasses and the appearance of those, and can you tell us, typically what kind of prairies are going to have cool season grasses? I mean, I think I can probably answer my own question, but then the management of that, and with more prescribed burns, are you going to see fewer cool season grasses? If you could comment on that.
That's a good question, because I kind of just use that term loosely to refer to non-native grasses. In some ways, that's a little bit misleading and maybe not quite as specific. Cool season grasses, warm season grasses, those are two terms used to describe the photosynthetic pathway that the plant uses. Cool season is C3 and warm season is C4. And we know that, warm season grasses, the C4 grasses, many of those are our dominant prairie species, like big blue stem, Indian grass, little blue stem, drop seeds. So I often just use, use cool season as sort of a quick way to just describe the non-native grasses, because almost all of those non-native grasses that are problems on prairies, brome grass, um, Timothy grass, orchard grass, bluegrass, fescues, those are all non-native forage grasses. They're all cool season grasses. So cool season, but it's important, of course, to realize that there are native cool season grasses too. Native cool season grasses like the porcupine grasses, stipa, or the wheat grasses, agropyron, the Canada wild rye or wild white grasses, so, and also June grass. So uh, when we look at a prairie and a reconstructed prairie, as we see there at Ewing, and we know that it used to be a pasture probably at one point in time, that certainly suggests that, again, those non-native cool season grasses were an important part of the vegetation then, and are likely always to be a problem because it's hard to get rid of them. The best way, over time, if you've got those grasses hanging on, well, again, we back up just a bit. Ken described spraying it. I believe they used an herbicide to burn or to top kill the vegetation that was there. Again, being mostly a pasture land, and I'm guessing they used Roundup, glyphosate, most likely. What I've seen is that does do a good job in top killing it for the time being. In the short term, you'll see that those grasses top kill and turn brown, and it looks like it's dead, but quite often it's not completely dead. The root systems are not dead, and you see that because the next year you come back after you've planted, and you'll see there's still a lot of non-native grass there. So one strategy that I think is important, if you are seeding into an area with non-native grasses, and they're going to be really, again, going to be a real problem in any kind of field or situation where then it used to be a pasture, or maybe there was a CRP field where there was a perennial grass cover. If you don't have perennial grass cover, again, if the reconstruction is into an area that was a bean field or a cornfield, then you actually usually have a much better situation, because cornfields and bean fields don't have brome grasses and Kentucky bluegrasses and fescue. So you have a lot less of a problem there. In those situations where you have them, again, it's going to be tough to get rid of them completely. I can say that for sure. What I try to do, and I learned the hard way by, again, on my own land and also in some research I've done, is the best way is to probably spend a couple years trying to get rid of those grasses. It takes more than 1 year to kill the root systems out, especially if you're using glyphosate. I think maybe a combination of glyphosate, I've not tried this, but I think maybe a combination of glyphosate, which would again kill anything, but then maybe coming back, or I don't know if you can tank mix them or not, but by putting clethodim into that mix as well. Clethodim is an herbicide that just kills grass, but it seems to be much more effective at killing grass than what glyphosate is. The point being, again, is that um, the best way to begin a reconstruction in a situation like that is to do as much as you possibly can to remove those cool season non-native grasses before you put any seed out. Because once you put the seed out there and you have prairie plants growing, now it becomes much more difficult. You have a lot fewer options as far as what you can do to deal with that grass. Once you got prairie plants growing there, the best strategy at that point now really is just probably mainly to use late spring burns, burning as late in the spring as you can, usually up to about May 15th or so. And that depends upon, of course, the fuel loads and the greenness of the vegetation, how much grass there is there to provide fine fuel. It depends on lots of other things as to whether you can do that or not. But by burning as late as possible, at least, you'll do the most damage to, again, brome grass and bluegrass, fescue grass. You could possibly do a clethodim application late in the year. I'd want to really look at the vegetation closely. I think maybe mowing it in September or something would be a good strategy. The point I'm making here is that if you can find a way to ensure that the prairie, especially the prairie grasses, have senesced. In other words, they've died back. They're perennial grasses, and so they will senesce. That again means the top parts of those plants have died back, and just the root system is really the only thing that's living there now. That's what happens over the winter, of course. But a lot of those non-native grasses that we are plagued with, they didn't, of course, again, they didn't evolve here. They're not North American species. They evolved in Europe or other places, Northern Asia, where there's a different environment, different seasonality. It naturally stays cooler there over into the winter. All those grasses will stay green and photosynthetic right up until you really start getting really some cold temperatures. So by November 1st, say, for example, it could be that all you've got green and growing out there are those non-native grasses that you want to get rid of. The rest of the prairie has senesced. Then it's safe to spray because anything that's, of course, senesced is not going to be affected. And again, an application of clethodim late in the growing season, might be a good way to remove those brome grasses and Kentucky bluegrasses. I've not tried that myself, but I'm thinking about trying it. I'll just quick mention, since there was a question about Ewing Park, and so while we were looking at the video, I pulled up my map of Ewing Park, and I'm looking at the map I produced that shows again, the best interpretation of what the native landscape was based on soils. And what I'm seeing for that whole area that the video was made in, all that forest vegetation and all the areas that Ken was talking about, that whole area I've got mapped as oak hickory tallgrass savanna. So based on the soils, that's that's what the soils say was there, not forest.
Okay, thank you for that clarification, Tom. All right, we are ready, Noah, to start up the video again. And again, reminder, if you have any questions, you can unmute yourselves. We're hopping into video now, or just use the chat area.
Okay, I overshot my spot a little bit, so I backed up. All right, here we go.
One challenge that a land manager might have as they begin to open up what was a forest, or what is a forest, opening up like you see here, opening it up more, getting the understory out, getting more light in, is that in some cases, some of the native herbaceous species might sort of over-respond to that. And you can kind of see a fairly good example of that throughout this area. And again, the species we looked at earlier, common black snakeroot. As we walk through here, there's really a large amount of it here. It's really very frequent. You're going to see it. And part of the reason, I think, is some of the life history of this plant. Certainly, it produces fruits that have little stick-type structures on them that make the fruit stick to the fur of raccoons and possums and mice. And so that really disperses the fruits, which of course carry the seeds, disperses those seeds far and wide. And I think, again, just the change from a more shaded environment to a more lit environment, this is a species that just responds to that very well. So, and it can grow quickly, again, coming from the seed bank perhaps, increases the amount of that we see. So that could prevent a challenge. And, I'm not sure what the answer is. It might be that once fire starts getting in here a little bit more and you start getting more of the other species that should be here as well, some of the grasses and sedges, for example, usually they are a little bit more competitive, and so they might help to push some of that common black snakeroot out a little bit. I kind of think of it as, you started with something that had changed over a long period of time, especially with invasive species in here. If there was a layer of honeysuckle and buckthorn, really changed the herbaceous layer. And now when you're trying to go back to something more natural, things can get out of kilter in a sense. Nature's not going to respond directly to, again, what you envision or what you think you might want. So you have to be prepared for that. That's the point here, is that some of these species are going to maybe take over for a brief time and become more dominant than what they should be. But again, we're trying to get something more open, as you see here. And one of the best ways of sort of verifying, sort of proving on the ground that maybe you're going in the right direction or that is the right decision, is if you find some of these large oak species or trees that have been grown in a more open environment, such as this bur oak down here. This individual here is huge. It's probably got a DBH of over a meter at least. So it's a pretty old individual. We can see that some of of course, the lower branches are dead there on the left, but we can also see that some of the other branches that were lower down are completely gone now. We see those holes and bumps there. Those are places where there was a branch. But it grew up in an environment that was more open. So that's a tree that's clearly over 200 years old. So 200 years ago, when it was growing here and becoming a tree and getting into the canopy, it was able to grow its branches in a very much widespread fashion, spreading its branches out. And oak prefers to grow that way if it can. And we see that aspect, to some extent there in that tree. That tells us, again, that this was a more open environment at the time this tree was growing. A tree like that is often called a wolf tree. I usually make notes of wolf trees when I do plant surveys and take a GPS so I know where they're at. It's called a wolf tree because, like the wolf, it's sort of a lone survivor. We don't usually see very many of these, so not very many of them. They're kind of the lone survivor of, again, when this environment was presumably a savanna or an open woodland.
So the public is welcome to come here and enjoy this area for themselves. We do have some hiking trails through here, and Ewing Park is located right off of Indianola Road. You'll see a barn. You can park at the barn, or across the road at the Lilac Arboretum. There's a larger parking lot there. And come see the rest of the parks in Des Moines.
Okay, so that is the end of our video, the last segment on the video. So anyone, any questions, comments, experiences to share? Don't hesitate.
Let's hear some experiences.
I may have to start calling on people. All right, Jennifer Welch, I'm going to call on you. You have woodland and prairie on your property. Can you share some experiences on management?
Ha, I knew you were going to call on me, Pat. Yeah, I was just thinking about my wolf trees and how that's an interesting term. I haven't done as much woodland burning as I would like to. I do more prairie burning, and I just haven't done as much, and I know it would respond nicely if I did. Honeysuckle is, I think, my biggest nemesis to get out, and I don't have those fancy mowers. I need like all of you to come over and help me or something, because it seems like a never-ending battle. I don't know, Tom, if you have any thoughts on how to do that as a person trying to manage.
Well, yes, I can sympathize with you because I've seen lots and lots of, especially private land that has that honeysuckle problem. Just so much of it. When I've been walking the land with the landowner and kind of helping them envision what they've got. It's always difficult telling them, about that honeysuckle problem and just how troublesome it's going to be. Uh, I know that what I do is just would suggest, I guess, is just start small. You definitely want to use an herbicide to stump treat as much as possible. I kind of use two strategies. If the honeysuckle is decent enough size, and by decent, I suppose, maybe at least an inch in diameter, then definitely want to try and treat that. I like to treat it with Garlon, which is, of course, it's a trade name for herbicide that contains triclopyr and some diesel. That makes a really good stump treatment. But I also will use just a brush cutter often to do this. And often if the stuff is smaller, if you have really smaller versions of whatever invasive, honeysuckle, whatever it may be, it's a lot easier and quicker, of course, to use like a steel brush cutter, but you really can't treat those very well. So what I do, and it works pretty well, I've done it on my own land here, is mow it off like that. Don't worry about treating it, but then watch it as it resprouts. And as it resprouts and gets up to about maybe a foot tall, you have a few leaves there. Then I'll foliar spray it. Use a backpack sprayer and go in and spray it. Either you can use triclopyr in a foliar formulation, or you can buy some ready to use stuff, I suppose, brush killer like at Thiesen's or something. I think you have to still mix that with water, but use something that will kill woody plants well, and then just spray those leaves. It's a lot easier, I think, to do that than try to meticulously try to treat little pencil-sized stems, which is really hard to do, and you're not going to find them all. What I suggest is, and I've done this on some private landowners with my Drake Prairie Rescue crews, we would flag off an area and just take small pieces, work on it first, try to get that as clean as you can, get it killed, and gradually do more and more as time permits. The problem is always going to be, unfortunately, and I don't have an answer, is that there's always going to be potential for reinvasion because there's just so much honeysuckle out there. Birds, unfortunately, disperse it very well. That's one of the reasons there's so much of it, of course, is that it's a fruit that hangs on to it stays on the shrubs into the wintertime, and that can be good for birds, but it's bad for us in that it's just a continual dispersal of those fruits and seeds. And even though you can clear your area, with enough time and work and dedication, go across the neighbor's fence or go into the neighbor's land, or just a half mile down the road or something, I'm sure you can find more of it. So there's always going to be a source for it. I think the answer there is to get it cleared out, and then try to get a native herbaceous layer reestablished there if there's not one that will be a little bit more resistant to those seeds. But yeah, there's no easy answer, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I've got one other question about just kind of woodlands in general. So I've got a few areas that are really nice oak woodlands, but not very many. And a lot of it's just not very great. A lot of cedar, but some other trees that are just not, it's not an oak hickory, it's not all oak hickory woodland. And so when you're looking at spots like that, whether it's city parks or wherever, how do you approach something where you can make it nicer and still have it be sort of woods,
Mm-hmm.
or do you
Yeah.
take it all out? I mean,
Yeah, that's a very good question, because those are important decisions that have to be made. I know that I would like to see the Des Moines parks, be a little bit more aggressive, I guess you might say, in removing trees, because what they have done a lot, and I can talk about Greenwood Park, you can talk about McRae Park. Those are two other parks where they've done a lot of work in forests that are grown over. They've done a lot of, again, opening up the understory, which is fine, but they're hesitant, I think, to take out very many large trees. And again, um, that's fine. But if you really want to say that you are restoring a woodland or you're restoring a savanna, if you're saying or professing that's what you're doing, then you're going to have to probably remove some trees, because you have to reduce the canopy cover. Again, I'm using a pretty straightforward definition of what a savanna or a woodland or a forest is. It's based on canopy cover. And canopy cover depends upon the number of trees and the size of their crowns. So in many cases, you could go in and you could remove, all of the non-oaks and non-hickories. Um, if you're again focusing on a system that should be oak hickory, of course, that would mean it would be an upland environment, fairly dry, or at least dry mesic, at least something like that. So you could be taking out, elms and ashes and basswoods and mulberries, a whole host of things that aren't oak hickories but are there, hackberries, all of those trees, could easily come out if you've got the energy. Another good way to do it, though, is like Ken described, I think, is to girdle them, and rather than have to deal with a lot of wood, let them stand there as a snag and provide habitat for woodpeckers. Eventually, those snags, of course, will fall down. In some ways, that's kind of preferable because you're getting some advantage. Those snags are being used for something rather than being taken out and burned. Um, One could argue, that the more wood that you take out and the more wood that you burn, in a sense, that's not good for global climate change, of course. But the amount of carbon that's coming from the wood that we burn is not that great in the big scheme of things, of course. But and again, really, just in some ways, keeping that wood out there and letting that wood fall on the ground and letting those nutrients naturally decompose and go back into the system would really be a better way. But in the meantime, somehow you have to get more light in there and get less crown, less leaves, so more light can come in. And so I think the girdling that Ken was showing you is sort of a good way to at least do some of that. You still might want to take some trees out. Some trees can be taken out and used for firewood.
yeah,
But
no, that's
I guess the point is, just to finish up, is someone has to make a decision about how many trees are going to come out, just how much you're going to open that up, what are you going to do with those trees. And I think in some ways, and reasonably, I can understand that Des Moines Parks has to be able to react and deal with the public. And so if you're taking out big oaks, that may not look so good. You may get a lot of questions about that. And so, maybe some areas you just really can't do that, because it would mean you're going to have to take out some big oaks in order to open it up more and make it more of a woodland or a savanna. Well, again, those are the areas in that you just don't do that. Those areas are going to stay forest, and you make them as good a forest as you can.
yeah. Is there anything such as a cedar forest, or is that sort of an oxymoron? What do you do with big batches of cedar forest.
Well, there are cedar forests that exist. We call those, extant communities. There are cedar forests that currently exist. I'm doing similar work out in the Les Hills where I'm mapping landscapes and delineating the extant plant communities and ecosystems. And I'm writing down on my maps cedar forests quite often because cedar forests do exist, but they're not natural. Of course, those cedar forests are completely due to the lack of fire. And even some of these forests I map as, mixed hardwood conifer forests because they've got a sort of a 50-50 mixture of hardwood trees and cedar trees. But cedar forests, they're the worst when it comes to sort of what can happen on the landscape, biodiversity wise. I took some pictures on my last trip out there last week to share with some friends just to show two different sizes of the same ridge. I was surveying I think it was a north-south trending ridge line. On one side of the ridge, it was a nice prairie. Walk over to the other side, and it was nothing but dense cedar trees. It was a cedar forest, and the picture of the prairie, there were probably 30, 40 different species at least in that picture. Prairie plants in the cedar forest, it was just like two species, 2 or 3 species. There's the cedar tree, and there's a few, maybe 1 or 2 other things that are able to grow in the shade. So cedar forests again are just devastating to prairies. They wouldn't have occurred naturally because they are so susceptible to fire. They cannot take fire. Anything that top kills them, they're not able to regrow from a root system that survives fire. So they don't survive fire. As long as you burn up nearly all of the above ground parts, that tree is going to be dead. Now, if you just burn a few of the lower branches and the upper part of the tree doesn't, escapes from the fire, then the tree's not dead because it's unless there was enough heat on the bark to kill the phloem tissue. But what often happens with cedars is that they're so dense, there's not enough fuel around the base of a cedar to bring enough fire in to do that. The places where, again, the cedar's a natural native tree. It should be out there in the landscape, but it would be very sporadic. It would be mainly found, and this is where you do find the native populations of cedars, the big trees. You find them on landscapes that have a lot of rocky outcrops, up in mainly, again, probably, maybe the eastern half of Iowa, but rocky outcrops, so rocky cliffs, canyons with rocky outcrops, because those rocky outcrops and those are kinds of environments where there was never enough fuel built up in order to carry a fire. And so those are again very fire protected parts of the landscape, and cedars will cedars will find those areas, and that's where they do well, and that's where they grow to be very old trees. Another place you see them, would have seen them, I think, on the native landscape is like out in the Flint Hills of Kansas right now. They do occur somewhat sporadically in some of the drainage ways, lower portions of the landscape that are somewhat wet. Because again, those wet portions of the landscape would have been somewhat fire protected, and that's where cedars would have survived. Any other trees on the landscape would not survive fire.
Hey, all right. Jen, thanks for hopping in. So that is it, unless there are any other questions. Anyone want to unmute? And let me check the chat area. Okay. I am not seeing any additional questions. So thank you, Tom, for sharing your expertise in the tour. Thank you, Noah, for behind the scenes video work. So we will see you all. Actually, we have another event coming up the end of June. So we will see you all then. Take care and have a great rest of your day.